The broadcast came from every direction at once. It did not arrive as a signal that needed decoding or a transmission that required a dish. It was a full-spectrum pulse, the kind that cut through walls and rock and steel and reached every receiver on the planet whether the receiver wanted it or not. The Kethari Empire had been perfecting that technology for 300 years. They used it the way a butcher uses a stamp, not to communicate, but to mark. The voice that came out of it was calm. It was almost gentle. High Consul Dravenov. The Kethari Empire spoke in the standard tongue of the Galactic Dominion, and his words were translated automatically into every human language by the same pulse that carried them. He said that humanity had fought bravely. He said that humanity had shown great spirit. He said that the war was now over, that Earth was now under the protective custody of the Dominion, and that the surviving human population would be permitted to rebuild their lives within the boundaries the Empire had been kind enough to define. He called it a gift. 47 years of war and 2 billion dead, and he called it a gift. On the surface of what had once been the city of Zurich, a small group of civilians gathered in the ruins of a public square and listened to the broadcast in silence. Some of them wept. Most of them just stood there, shoulders bent, faces empty. One old woman sat down on a broken piece of concrete and put her hands over her ears, not because she could not hear, but because she did not want to hear anymore. 1,700 meters below that square, inside a tunnel system that did not appear on any map that any alien government had ever seen, a man named Dorian Hale sat in a metal chair and watched the broadcast on a small screen. He did not weep. He did not look away. He watched the High Consul speak, and he watched the alien diplomats practice expression of magnanimity, and he did not say a single word for the full 6 minutes that the broadcast lasted. When it ended, he reached forward and turned the screen off. Hale was 63 years old. His hair had gone white sometime during the 3rd year of the war, and his left hand carried a tremor from a nerve injury he had taken during the siege of Brisbane. He had been an admiral once, in a fleet that the galaxy now believed had been destroyed. He wore no uniform. Down here, there was no point. The room around him was plain and lit by low yellow lights. There were 8 other people in it, analysts, officers, communications staff, and all of them were watching him. They had been watching him since the broadcast began. They were waiting. He let them wait for another moment. Then he said, "Get me Rourke." Director Sable Rourke arrived 4 minutes later. She was younger than Hale by a decade, dark-haired, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. She had been running the Office of Strategic Recovery for 11 years, since the old director had died of a heart condition that the war had made worse. She was the person who knew more secrets than anyone else alive on Earth. She sat down across from Hale and folded her hands on the table. "The signal reached every colony node," she said. 17 of our listening posts confirmed reception. The Kethari didn't miss a single frequency. "They never do," Hale said. "How's the surface response?" "Grief. Confusion. A few small protests that won't last. The people up there genuinely believe we lost." She paused. "In a way, it's better that they do." Hale nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The lie had kept them safe. 47 years of looking beaten, of playing the part of a broken species, had kept the Kethari from looking harder than they needed to. The Empire was not cruel without reason. It was simply arrogant. And arrogance had a quality that Hale had spent his entire career studying. It stopped looking for what it did not expect to find. The Kethari had scanned Earth. They had mapped the ruins. They had counted the bodies and the dead satellites and the scorched launch pads, and they had drawn their conclusions like a man reading the total at the bottom of a bill. The number matched what they expected. They moved on. They had not looked down. "We received a signal from the outer reach this morning," Rourke said. She slid a data pad across the table. Hale picked it up. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Arvath Prime, a human colony world, 17 light years from Earth, established during the early expansion decades before the war. Population just under 400,000. The signal was encoded in a protocol so old that the Kethari would not have recognized it as a military channel. It looked like background noise. It had been sent by the colony's civil defense coordinator, a woman named Berta Olm, who reported that 3 Kethari battle groups had entered the system and were demanding full administrative surrender within 48 hours. She also reported that 2 of the colony's orbital stations had already been destroyed as a demonstration. She did not ask to be saved. That was not what the signal said. The signal said, "We are here, we are still standing, and we wanted someone to know." Hill set the data pad down very carefully. "How long have we been waiting for a reason?" he asked. Rourke did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a moment with something that was almost, but not quite, an emotion. Then she said, "Long enough." Hill stood up. He was not a tall man, and the years had not been generous, but when he stood up in that small underground room, something in the space changed. The 8 analysts and officers seemed to pull slightly straighter without meaning to. "Contact Commander Vane," he said. "Tell her to begin the pre-activation sequence. Tell her I want a full readiness report from every vault section within the hour." He looked at Rourke. "And then I want transport to the Pacific Node." Rourke nodded once. She was already moving. Down the corridor, down 3 more levels, past a door that required 4 separate clearances to open, past another door that had no markings at all. The tunnel system opened into something that was not a tunnel anymore. It was a cavern, but the word did not really fit what it was. It was a space so large that the ceiling, nearly 200 meters above, was lost in shadow. The floor was covered in water, black, cold, perfectly still, and rising. From that water in long, dark rows were ships. Not small ships, not scout craft or patrol vessels, warships. Dozens of them in this cavern alone, and this was only one of 11 such caverns positioned at strategic points across the floors of Earth's oceans. They had been down here for 47 years. They had been built in silence, piece by piece, using salvage from the war and materials mined from the deep ocean floor, and technology developed by engineers who had never once been permitted to breathe fresh air while they worked. The ships were dark now, their systems in standby, their crews aboard, and waiting in quiet rotation shifts that had lasted, for some of them, their entire lives. They were not the fleet the world remembered. They were something new, something that the galaxy had never been given a reason to look for. A single light came on near the water's edge, then another, then a whole row of them, running the length of the nearest ship's hull, soft and blue, the color of a system. Waking up. Somewhere above, High Consul Draven was preparing for his ceremonial visit to Earth's surface, ready to walk through the ruins and be photographed looking gracious. He had no idea what was sleeping beneath his feet. The submarine did not use its lights. It moved through the deep water the way a thought moves through a sleeping mind, quietly, without disturbing anything, present and then gone. The pressure outside. Its hull at this depth was enough to flatten a standard vessel in under a second. This submarine had been built for exactly this depth, and no other reason. It did not have a name on its side. It did not carry a registration signal on any sensor that any member of the Galactic Dominion operated. It was simply not there. Dorian Hale sat in the forward compartment and watched the water outside the viewport. There was nothing to see. The lights were off, and the ocean at this depth did not allow anything else in. But he watched anyway, the way a man watches the road on a long drive through the dark, not because there is anything to see, but because the act of watching is itself a kind of commitment to where he is going. The journey took 4 hours. When the submarine finally slowed and the dock clamps engaged with a sound like a single deep breath, Hale stood and rolled his neck once and walked out into the light. The Pacific Vault was the largest of the 11. The cavern here was 2 kilometers long and nearly half a kilometer wide, carved out of the basalt shelf that sat beneath the floor of the ocean at a depth that no standard survey mission would ever reach. The water that filled its lower third was kept still by a system of baffles that had taken 6 years to install correctly. The air was kept at a constant 14 degrees and smelled faintly of metal and machine oil, and the ships were everywhere. Hale walked out onto the upper service gantry and stopped. He had been here before. He had been here when the first frame was laid. He had been here when the first hull was sealed. He had attended 27 launching ceremonies. In this cavern alone, every one of them silent. No music, no crowd, no transmission. Just the people who built the thing and the people who would one day sail it standing. In the dark together and understanding what it meant. But it was different now. The ships were complete. All of them. The rows extended. Away from him until they were too far to see clearly, and every one of those hulls was sealed and armed and crewed and waiting. The lights running along their sides were that same soft blue, the standby color, and together they turned the cavern into something that looked almost like a city seen from above at night. 312 ships, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, and at the far end of the cavern, longest and darkest of all, the one that made the rest of them look small, the Unyielding. A Titan-class dreadnought, the only one in existence. It had taken 19 years to build and had required the work of over 4,000 engineers, many of whom had lived their entire professional lives in the vault system and died before the ship was finished. Its hull was 2 kilometers long. Its main gun arrays were designed to fire rounds that would not just damage a Kethari capital ship, they would end the conversation entirely. Hill looked at it for a while. Then he heard footsteps behind him. "She's been at full standby for 6 hours, said the woman who walked up beside him. Her name was Ona Marsh, and she was 61 years old, and she had been the chief engineer of the Pacific Vault for the last 22 years. She was short and wide-shouldered and had the hands of someone who had spent decades fixing things that were not supposed to break. Every system is nominal. I ran the full diagnostic twice, because I did not trust the first one. And the second one," Hale said, "better than nominal. She's better than she was when we finished her." Ona folded her arms. "We've had 20 years to keep improving her. Didn't have much else to do." The faint sound of something like dry humor in her voice. Hale recognized it. Down here, humor was how people kept moving. When you spent your life in a sealed cavern, at the bottom of the ocean, maintaining warships that you were not allowed to tell anyone about, for a war you did not know would ever actually happen, you either found a way to laugh at the shape of it, or you stopped functioning. Most of the people in the vaults had found a way to laugh. "Give me the numbers," Hale said. Ona reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of actual paper, not a data pad, not a screen. Paper. Down here, they had learned a long time ago that physical documents were safer than digital ones. She unfolded it and handed it to him. 312 vessels total across all 11 vaults. Combat readiness. Across the fleet is 97.4% average. The 4 ships below that threshold are all at 93 or above. Minor issues, nothing that affects weapons or propulsion. Crew complements are at full strength. Ammunition and fuel reserves are at 104% of operational requirement, because we kept producing past the target. She paused. "I wasn't sure when we'd be needed, so I kept the factories running." Hill looked at the sheet. Then he looked up at the Unyielding. "And her?" 100%, Ona said. There was something in her voice when she said it. Something that was not quite pride, because pride was too small a word. "She has never been fired. Every round is still in its housing. Every drive is still in the configuration we set when she was commissioned. She has been waiting her whole life for this, and she is ready." Hale handed the sheet back. He walked down the gantry toward the dreadnought, and Ona walked with him, and neither of them spoke for a while. They passed smaller ships on the way, a row of destroyers, their hulls dark and angular, designed to move fast and hurt hard and take punishment without stopping. They passed a group of crew members running systems checks on a frigate's port engine array. The crew members saw Hale and went still. He nodded to them. They nodded back. Nobody saluted. There were no ceremonies here. At the base of the Unyielding's boarding ramp, a woman was waiting. She was younger than both of them, early 30s, lean, with the kind of eyes that were always doing 2 things at once. Her name was Iris Vane. She had been born in the Atlantic Vault and had never seen open sky until she was 12 years old. She was the finest tactical mind Hale had encountered in 40 years of military service, and she was the one who had spent the last 8 years building the operational plan that sat in the secure case she was holding now. "Fleet is ready," she said without preamble. "All Vault commanders have confirmed. Pre-activation is complete across all 11 sites. We are waiting for your word. Hale looked at her, then at Ona, then at the ship behind them. He thought about Arvath Prime and the woman named Berta Olm who had sent a signal. Into the dark not because she expected an answer, but because she wanted someone to know they were still standing. He thought about High Consul Draven walking through Zurich's ruins like a man, inspecting a property he had already bought. He thought about 47 years of silence and patience and the cost paid by every person who had lived in these vaults and built these ships and trained and waited and believed that the waiting would eventually mean something. Authorization code, he said. His voice was level. Iris opened the case and held up the panel inside it. Hale placed his hand on it. The panel read his biometrics, and the words on the small screen changed from standby to active. A sound moved through the cavern, not loud, not sudden, but deep and continuous and growing. The unyielding systems came fully online. Around the cavern, one by one, every ship's standby lights shifted from soft blue to a steady, bright white. Active. Ready. 3,000 kilometers away, in the Atlantic Vault, the same thing was happening. And in the vault beneath the Indian Ocean, and beneath the Arctic Shelf, and in 8 others, spread across the hidden geography of a planet the galaxy thought had given up. Bring us up, Hale said. Ona Marsh turned and walked back to her station. She sat down, cracked her knuckles once, and began entering the sequence that nobody outside these walls had ever seen. The vast doors in the ocean floor, disguised for 47 years as nothing more than a particular pattern of deep-sea rock formation, began to open. Above them, for 1,000 meters of ocean. Above that, air and sky and a galaxy that had made one very significant error in its accounting. It had forgotten to look down. The planet Arvath Prime had 2 moons. The smaller one, called Drev by the colonists, was barely large enough to hold its round shape. It looked like something the planet had meant to throw away and then forgotten about. The colonists had never built anything on it. There was no resource worth the effort, no position worth the installation. It sat in its small, obedient orbit and did nothing useful. For 48 hours, it had been doing something useful. The Kethari fleet was using Drev's shadow to stage part of its formation. 3 gunships positioned on the moon's far side where the colony's ground sensors could not directly track them. It was a standard tactical arrangement. The Empire's fleet doctrine called it a flanking anchor, and it worked well against every species the Kethari had dealt with in the last 2 centuries. Fleet Marshal Torresane stood on the bridge of his command vessel and reviewed the situation with the particular kind of satisfaction that comes from a job that is already over. The colony below had not responded to the surrender demand. The clock had run out 11 minutes ago. His orders were clear. Begin the second demonstration, he said. His weapons officer confirmed. A moment later, 2 of his cruisers rotated and fired. On the colony's 3rd orbital station. The station cracked, then came apart in a slow and quiet way that had always struck Torresane as strange. How something large could die so softly in space, where there was no air to carry the sound of it. Below, in the colony, alarms would be going off. People would be frightened. That was the purpose. He did not enjoy it, but he understood it. A species that was frightened quickly was a species that stopped fighting quickly, and a species that stopped fighting quickly lost fewer people than one that needed more convincing. He had told himself this so many times over the years that it had become simply true, the way arithmetic is true. He was not thinking about the possibility of an answer. There was no answer coming. The humans were a broken species on a broken planet under formal Dominion protection. The colonists here had no fleet, no military command structure, no reinforcement. They had nothing. He was wrong, and the first sign of it arrived 11 minutes later. One of his sensor officers straightened suddenly, not the practiced movement of a person responding to a reading, but the involuntary straightening of a person who has received information they do not understand. The officer looked at the screen again. Then he looked up. Marshal, he said, I have contacts. FTL dropout. Bearing 271 system. Edge. Torresane turned. Kethari. No, sir. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds, which was 1 second too long. No identification signal at all. The marshal moved to the sensor station and looked at the display himself. The contacts were appearing one by one in a line along the edge of the system, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a pattern he recognized as coordinated, not a scattered emergence, not a trade convoy or a refugee flight. Coordinated. Military. He counted them without speaking. Then he counted them again. "That is not possible," said someone behind him. He did not look to see who. 312 ships. He had 80, and even that number did not capture the problem, because the problem was not just the count. The problem was the size. His sensors were giving him mass readings for the contacts now, and the largest of them, the one sitting at the center of the formation like a word that ends in argument, outmassed his own flagship by a factor of 4. He had been in this fleet for 28 years. He had served in 4 military campaigns. He had never, in all of that, felt the particular sensation that moved through him now as he looked at the sensor display. It was not quite fear. It was something that sat just before fear, in the place where the mind realizes it has made an error but has not yet fully understood the size of it. "Can you identify the hull profiles?" he said. "I'm trying, sir." The sensor officer's voice was careful. "The profiles don't match any current human vessel class in our records. They don't match any class in the Dominion registry either." Another pause. "But the construction methods, the geometry of the hulls, they're consistent with human engineering principles." "That can't be human," said his second officer from across the bridge. "Humans have nothing left. We confirmed the destruction of their fleet 7 years into the war." "We confirmed the destruction of the fleet they showed us," Torresane said, and his own voice surprised him. It was too quiet, too flat, the voice of a man running a calculation he does not want to finish. The comm panel on his armrest lit up. "Incoming transmission. Standard frequency. Human encoding." He stared at it for a moment before accepting. The voice that came through was unhurried. It belonged to a man who did not sound angry, or triumphant, or nervous. He sounded the way a person sounds when they are telling you something they have been waiting a long time to say. "This system is under human protection." That was all. 6 words, and then the channel closed. On the neutral observer vessel called the Variance I, which was positioned 200,000 kilometers from the engagement zone in accordance with Dominion observer protocols, a young man named Davi Oren had his face very close to his sensor screen. He was 28 years old, a junior liaison officer assigned to the ship as a representative of Earth's civilian government, a position that had been largely ceremonial for years because Earth's civilian government did not have much to represent anymore. He had been watching the Kethari fleet conduct its operations above Arvath Prime, with the helpless attention of a person watching something terrible happen from too far away to stop it. He had filed formal protests with the Variance I command. He had sent messages to the Dominion Council. He had done everything he could, which had amounted to nothing, because the Dominion Council did not prioritize the complaints of a broken species with no leverage. When the FTL contacts appeared on the shared sensor feed, his first thought was that it was an equipment error. His second thought, when the count reached 50 and kept climbing, was that he needed to start recording everything. He activated the Variance I's full sensor suite and began a transmission log. The ship's captain, a Varith named Haas, gray-scaled and careful, came to stand beside him and watched the display with an expression that Davi had learned over months of working together meant that Haas was unsettled. "Do you know what those ships are?" Haas said. "Yes," Davi said. He did not look away from the screen. "I think I do." He thought about the transmission he had sent to Earth 3 days ago, the one he had encoded in a frequency so old and obscure that he had not expected a response. He had sent it because he was desperate and because sending it had seemed better than not sending it. He had not expected this. No one had expected this. Torresane stared at the human formation for 70 seconds after the transmission ended. His bridge was quiet in the way that bridges get quiet when the people on them are waiting for their commander to decide something. He decided. "All ships, attack formation," he said. "We are not retreating from a broken species." His weapons officer looked at him for just a moment too long before confirming it. was the look of a person who has done the arithmetic and does not like the answer but is not in a position to say so. The Kethari fleet began to move. Across the system, on the bridge of the unyielding, Iris Vane watched them come. She stood at the tactical display with her hands behind her back and tracked the movement of every one of the 80 enemy ships with the focused attention of a person who had spent 8 years planning for exactly this scenario. "They're committing," she said. "Yes," said Rinaldus from the command chair. Captain Rinaldus was 44, lean, and deliberate in the way that only people who have spent their lives in enclosed spaces tend to be. He had commanded the unyielding since she was commissioned and knew every system in her the way a musician knows an instrument. "Let them come. We know this formation. We planned for this formation." He looked at Vane. "Execute." The envelope. Iris Vane turned to her station. The human fleet moved. There is a concept in Kethari military doctrine called the stable wall. It is simple. When an enemy is numerically inferior, you advance on them in a broad front, presenting the largest possible face of firepower, forcing the smaller force to either retreat or commit to a frontal exchange it cannot win. The doctrine had been formalized 3 centuries ago and had been used successfully in 41 engagements since. It had never failed. Not once. The Kethari considered it one of the cleaner solutions to the problem of combat, straightforward, reliable, not complicated by variables. The reason it had never failed was because every species the Kethari had used it against had done the rational thing when faced with a wall of firepower. They had tried to fight the wall directly, or they had retreated. Both outcomes worked for the Kethari. Both outcomes were built into the doctrine. Nobody had ever simply gone around it. The human fleet did not form a counterwall. It did not try to match the Kethari front. The 312 ships moved in a way that Torasane's tactical officers had never seen in a real engagement, not in files, not in simulations, not in anything, because the people who designed the maneuver had spent years studying Kethari doctrine specifically to find the one thing it had never been tested against. The human fleet split. Not into 2 groups, not into 3, into 7 simultaneous streams, each one moving at a different angle, each one targeting a different structural point in the Kethari formation. 5 of the streams were frigates and destroyers, fast, aggressive, built to absorb fire and keep moving. They drove into the gaps between the Kethari ships and forced the formation to turn inward to address them. The 6th stream was the heavy cruisers, coming around the outer edge at a high arc, using the planet's gravity to assist the turn in a way that no Kethari fleet planner would have considered worth attempting because it required a level of precision that should not have been possible in combat conditions. The 7th stream was the unyielding. She came in alone, straight through the center of where the Kethari formation had been before it started turning. The Kethari ships that tried to engage her fired everything they had, some of it connected. The unyielding did not stop. Her armor had been designed to absorb the kind of fire she was receiving now, and her engineers had spent 2 decades improving that design, and the result was a ship that moved through an 80-vessel fusillade the way a fist moves through smoke. When she was at the center of the formation, her broadside batteries opened. On the Variant's eye, Davi Oren was recording everything. His hands were steady on the controls. His face was not entirely steady, but he did not have time to notice that. He was watching the sensor feed and narrating into the log simultaneously, not because anyone had told him to, but because he understood, in a way that went beyond training, that what was happening in this system right now was something that the rest of the galaxy needed to see. Captain Haas stood beside him and did not say a word for the first 12 minutes of the engagement. He simply watched. His gray scales had taken on a slightly paler shade, which, in a Varith, was the equivalent of a human's jaw dropping. "They are not fighting to contain the Kethari," Haas said eventually, with the tone of someone thinking out loud rather than speaking to another person. "They are fighting to disassemble them. Methodically." "Yes," Davi said. "This was planned." "Every piece of it," Davi said. For a very long time. He thought about the 47 years that humans had been considered finished. He thought about the Dominion Council resolutions that had reclassified humanity as a Protected remnant species, not because anyone was being compassionate, but because a remnant species was not worth worrying about. He thought about every diplomatic channel that had been closed, every request for mediation that had been ignored, every appeal that had been filed and shelved and forgotten. He thought about the fact that while all of that was happening, somebody had been down in the dark building this. On the Kethari command vessel, Torresane was watching his fleet get taken apart, with the particular horror of a professional who recognizes, in real time, that he is witnessing something he fundamentally did not prepare for. His formation was gone. The stable wall had been rendered meaningless in under 9 minutes. His ships were no longer fighting a coordinated battle. They were fighting individually, each one responding to its own immediate threats, unable to support the others because the human frigates had driven between them and the human cruisers had closed off the routes that would allow reconsolidation. It was not a battle anymore. It was a lesson. Marshal, his comms officer turned from the panel. We have lost contact with 7 vessels. 14 more are reporting critical damage. The flanking group behind Drev. They're gone. The human cruiser arc came around the planet and hit them before they could reposition. Torresane stared at the display. He was not a man who panicked. He had survived difficult situations before, and he had survived them by thinking clearly. He thought clearly now. He looked at the numbers, and he understood them without sentiment. He could not win this. He had not been able to win this from the moment those ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel. He had simply not known it yet. All ships, fighting withdrawal, he said. Open a channel to the fleet. Now. His comms officer opened the channel. Torresane leaned toward it. This is Fleet Marshal Torresane to all commands. We are withdrawing. Do not break. And run. Cover each other. Move on my vector. He straightened. And someone opened. A line to Kethari High Command. Priority 1. He paused, and he looked at the display one more time. And when he spoke again, his voice was carefully flat. Tell them Earth has a fleet. A real fleet. Tell them we were wrong about everything. The channel closed. On the unyielding, Iris Vane watched the Kethari ships begin their withdrawal. She tracked the movement, confirmed the pattern, ran the intercept calculation in under for seconds, and then did not enter the order that would have cut the retreat off. She looked across the bridge at Ronaldus. He shook his head once. She took her hand away from the panel. The decision had been made long before this battle, in the planning rooms of the underground vaults, in the strategic sessions that Hale had run year after year. You let the survivors go, not out of mercy, though there was some of that too. You let them go because a fleet that returns home carrying the memory of what it just experienced is more useful to your long-term position than a complete military victory that leaves the enemy's government with nothing to be afraid of. The fear needed to travel. The story needed to reach the Dominion Council, and the only way it reached them intact was if the people who had lived it carried it there themselves. 31 Kethari ships completed the withdrawal. 49 did not. The human fleet lost no vessels. 11 ships had sustained damage that would require repair. None of them had lost the capacity to fight. Hale, monitoring from the Unyielding's command deck, heard the final numbers from Iris Vane and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Casualty report. Vane checked the fleet-wide feed. The number was so low that she almost said it. Twice to confirm it. She said it once. It was a number that represented the people who had been hurt in the engagement, not killed, hurt, and it was small enough that it should not have been possible, except that the ships had been built and the crews had been trained for precisely this, and nothing had been left to improvisation. Hale absorbed it. He put his hands behind his back and looked out at Arvath Prime. Below, the colony world, lit by its sun, intact, its surviving orbital stations still functional. Down there, 400,000 people who had sent a signal into the dark were still alive. The orbital bombardment had stopped 22 minutes into the engagement, when the Kethari ships had needed every gun they had facing the other direction. He thought about Berta Oln and the signal she had sent. He turned to the comms officer. Open a channel to the colony. The channel opened. He said, This is Admiral Dorian Hale, Earth Defense Command. Arvath Prime, you are safe. We are here. We apologize for the wait. There was a long silence on the channel. and then, very faintly, over the carrier. Frequency, something that sounded like a crowd, a large crowd, a very large crowd. A crowd of 400,000 people who had been waiting for 2 days to find out if they were going to survive. Hale closed the channel before his face could do something he would not have wanted his crew to see. Begin Phase 2, he said. The Vareth Conclave was the oldest structure in the known galaxy that had been built by a species still alive to maintain it. It had been constructed over 900 years ago when the Vareth had first proposed a gathering body for the sentient civilizations of the known systems. The building had been expanded 14 times since, each expansion representing the admission of a new member species. It was enormous now, a space station the size of a small moon, its architecture a layered accumulation of 9 centuries and a dozen different engineering traditions. The Vareth called it the House of Voices, though. In the standard diplomatic tongue, it was just the Conclave, and in practice it was the place where the powerful gathered to manage the less powerful, and everyone understood this, and most of them pretended otherwise. When word of the Battle of Arvath Prime reached the Conclave, the Sessions Chamber was in the middle of a routine trade arbitration between 2 species whose names took 17 syllables each to pronounce correctly. The session stopped. The arbitration was postponed. Every delegate in the building was redirected to the full council chamber within the hour. It was the fastest the chamber had assembled in 60 years. High Consul Draven arrived from Earth orbit on an emergency transport. He had been there for his ceremonial visit, walking through the ruins, being photographed, performing the role of a magnanimous victor when the news reached him. He had stood in what had once been a human city park, surrounded by his own security detail, and read the initial transmission from Torresane 3 times before he believed it. He did not believe it then either, but he had no choice but to respond. He entered the chamber still in his ceremonial dress. He did not have time to change. He would regret that detail later when recordings of this session were distributed across the Dominion. It made him look like what he was, a man who had been caught completely unprepared. The chamber was a large circular space with tiered seating for each member species, and a central floor for address. When Draven took his position, the noise in the chamber was at a level he had never heard here before. Not argument. Argument was common in this room. This was something closer to alarm. He addressed the chamber directly. He spoke of the incident at Arvath Prime as exactly that, an incident. A confrontation with unregistered human military assets. A situation that required investigation. He called for a joint Dominion response, forced to be assembled and dispatched to the outer reach. He was interrupted 17 times before he finished speaking. In the conclave, an interruption required formal recognition from the chair. The chair, occupied by Elder Council Yara of the Vareth, a being who had sat in that seat for 40 years and had seen every kind of political theater that the galaxy had to offer, granted recognition to each interruption in turn and said very little herself. The Torvani delegate asked how it was possible that a species under formal dominion protection had concealed a military fleet of this size for nearly 5 decades. The Sul delegate asked who had conducted the post-war verification of human military assets and why that verification had apparently been so incomplete. The Marat delegate, whose species had been proposed for Dominion membership 40 years ago, had been repeatedly delayed, and who had watched the process with accumulated bitterness, asked quietly whether the Dominion's assessment protocols were this unreliable for all subject species, or specifically for the ones that were deemed convenient to underestimate. That last question produced a silence that lasted for 11 seconds, which was a very long silence in a room that had been this loud. Draven answered none of these questions satisfactorily, because no satisfactory answers existed. The conversation had been going for 3 hours when the chamber's entrance signal chimed. An unscheduled arrival. The chair's steward checked the identification and leaned to speak quietly to Elder Council Yara. Yara's expression, which had been carefully neutral for the entire session, moved in a direction that was not neutral. She looked at the chamber. She looked at the entrance signal. She made a decision. The chair recognizes an unscheduled address request from the representative of The human species, she said, and Grant's entry. Draven turned from the floor. The man who walked in through the main entrance of the Varith Conclave's full council chamber wore a plain gray uniform with no rank insignia on it. He was 63 years old. He walked without hurrying, without looking around the room to assess reactions, without any of the visible performances that people usually engaged in when they entered a space like this for the first time. He walked to the central floor, and he stopped. "My name is Dorian Hale," he said. "I am the commander of the Earth Defense Command. I am here to deliver a message on behalf of the human species." He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document. "Real paper," he said. It on the speaker's stand in front of him and unfolded it without looking at it. Because he did not need to look at it. He had written these words himself. He knew them. "Effective immediately," he said. "The Earth Defense Command requires the following. First, full and unconditional withdrawal of all Dominion and Dominion-affiliated military forces from every system containing a human settlement. Second, formal recognition of all human colony worlds as sovereign territory under the same protections extended to full Dominion member species. Third, comprehensive reparations for every human world that sustained damage during the conflict that your records call the Dominion War and that our records call the first 11 years of our patience." He paused. "Fourth," he said, "a seat on this council, equal to any member, not observer status, not a protected species representative. A seat." The chamber noise that followed was substantial. Draven moved to the floor. "This body does not negotiate under military duress," he said. His voice was firm, but there was something strained behind it. "You have no standing here, Admiral. You are a protected remnant species. Whatever assets you have concealed, whatever incident occurred at Arvath Prime, this council will not." "With respect," Hale said, cutting across him in a voice that did not rise at all. "You have not yet counted the ships." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I brought the fleet," he said. "All of it. 312 vessels. They are currently in a standard holding position at the edge of this system, outside Dominion safety perimeters, broadcasting full identification on open channels so that no one needs to wonder what they are or why they are there. I am not threatening this station. I am demonstrating a fact. The fact is this: the human species is not what your records say we are. We have not been what your records say we are for quite some time." He folded the paper and put it back in his jacket. "The question now is whether this council would like to update its records before or after we determine our next steps independently." The vote was called 2 hours later. It was not unanimous, but it passed. Back on Earth, Director Sable Rourke stood in front of the full civilian parliament that had been called into emergency session and presented the complete files of the Mariana Doctrine. All of them. Every decision. Every cost. Every name of every person who had lived in the vaults. The parliament sat in silence for almost the entire presentation, and when it was over there were many questions, and Rourke answered all of them. And the last question asked was from an elderly member of parliament who had been a child during the end of the war. He asked, "Did anyone know? On the surface, did any of us know?" "No," Rourke said. "That was the point. If any of you had known, you would have acted like people who knew, and people who knew would have been noticed." The parliament received this answer in silence. Some of them were angry. Most of them were not, because the planet above their heads was still intact and the news from Arvath Prime was still coming in, and 400,000 people were alive who might not have been. Across the ocean, in a quiet coastal town that had been rebuilding since the end of the war, Ona Marsh sat on a wooden bench outside a small building and looked at the sky. She had been given 2 weeks of leave, the first leave she had taken in 30 years. She was not sure what people did on leave. She had spent the first day sitting outside and looking at things she had not seen in a long time. Sky, horizon, trees, birds. She was not doing anything in particular. She was slowly discovering the point. 1 year after the Battle of Arvath Prime, a Varith scholar named Osru published a paper that ran to 412 pages. It was titled The Mariana Doctrine and the Limits of Threat Assessment. The core argument was simple. even if the evidence marshaled to support it was not. It said, in essence, that the Galactic Dominion and its member species had made a systematic error, not a military error, not a political error, but a deeper kind, a failure of imagination. They had looked at the human species at its lowest point and had concluded that the lowest point was the truth of what humans were. They had treated a moment as a permanent condition. They had looked at the rubble and decided the rubble was the answer, and they had not asked what the rubble might be hiding. The paper was required reading at the military academies of 6 Dominion species. Within 3 months of publication, 2 species that had previously shown no interest in human affairs requested formal diplomatic contact with Earth's new government. Within 6 months, the Kethari Empire did not request anything. The Kethari Empire was occupied with its own problems. High Consul Draven had returned from the Conclave to find that his own government was not in a forgiving mood. The loss at Arvath Prime, the humiliation at the Council, the revelation that Kethari intelligence had failed completely to detect the largest covert military construction program in the galaxy's recorded history. None of this could be contained. The Kethari Senate was not a body that accepted failure quietly, and it was especially intolerant of failures that had been broadcast lived to every species in the Dominion by an enthusiastic young human with a recording system and a very good seat. Draven was removed from his post on the 43rd day after the battle. He was not imprisoned. He was not executed. He was simply dismissed, his title rescinded, his offices vacated, his ceremonial seals collected by a junior minister, who could barely look him in the eye while doing it. He was given a small residence in the Kethari capital and a modest allowance and no further responsibilities. For a man who had spent 30 years accumulating power and position and the ability to walk into rooms and have them go quiet in his direction, this was a sentence worse than anything formal. He understood that, and the people who made the decision had understood it too. In some ways, the Kethari Senate was very good at the things it was good at. Fleet Marshal Torres Sane, by contrast, was reassigned rather than dismissed. His report on the engagement at Arvath Prime was thorough, honest, and contained no attempt to deflect responsibility. He had said, in the report, that the human fleet had been tactically superior in every measurable way and that a different outcome was not available with the resources he had possessed. He had also said that no intelligence failure on his part could explain why his command had possessed entirely wrong information about the state of human military capacity, since that information had come from the top of the command structure and not from his own assessment. This had not made him popular with the people at the top of the command structure, but it had made him credible to the people who read the report afterward, and credibility, in the long run, was more durable than popularity. On Earth, the hidden colonies emerged. It happened over several months, not all at once, a careful process managed by Sable Rourke and the new Civilian Oversight Committee that had been established in the wake of the Mariana Doctrine's public reveal. The people who came out were extraordinary in ways that the surface world found difficult to absorb initially. They were engineers and soldiers and doctors and scientists, and they had been raised in environments where the expectation of competence was not a hope but a requirement, because in a sealed vault at the bottom of the ocean there was no room for anyone who could not carry their weight. They were also, many of them, people who had never seen open sky. The integration was not without difficulty. There was grief on both sides, surface humans who were angry about secrets kept from them, vault humans who were not sure how to exist in a world that was not structured around a single purpose. There were arguments. There were political tensions that kept Rourke's committee busy for months. There were moments when it seemed like the thing that had held them all together, the shared weight of the long wait, might not be enough to hold them together now that the wait was over. But it held. Mostly it held. Davi Oren arrived at the Varith Conclave for the first formal session of Humanities' new council seat on a morning that the station's environmental systems had calibrated to the equivalent of mild spring. He was 29 years old. He was the youngest person ever to serve as a full vote delegate to the Dominion Council, a fact that had been reported extensively and that he was trying to stop thinking about. He sat in the seat that had been installed for the human delegation. It had been built by Vareth craftspeople to human specifications, which meant it was slightly more upright and firmer than any other seat in the chamber, because the humans who had provided the specifications had apparently all spent years in military environments and had specific opinions about chairs. Elder Council Yara was in the presiding seat across the chamber. She had been in that seat, on and off, for 40 years. She had seen many new delegations take their first session. When the chamber recognized the human delegation for the first time, she watched Davi Oren stand up, and she paid attention, because she had been paying attention to humans since the battle, and she found that paying attention to them was a habit she had not yet decided to break. Davi spoke simply. He said that humanity was not there to seek revenge, and not there to assert superiority, and not there to relitigate the history of the last half-century. He said they were there because they intended to be part of the galaxy they lived in, and they intended to be part of it on honest terms, and those terms included being recognized for what they actually were rather than what was convenient to believe. He said the human species wanted to build and explore and be left in peace. And then, with the quietness of a man who has thought carefully about how to say something true without making it into a performance, he said that they had learned, at great cost, that peace must sometimes be built quietly and defended loudly. The chamber did not applaud. The Dominion Council did not applaud as a practice. But there was a quality to the silence when he sat down that was different from the silence that usually followed an address. Yara noticed it. She thought it was the silence of a room full of species who were revising a number of assumptions that they had held for a very long time and finding the revision uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. She had been the chair of this body for 40 years. She thought it was about time. In a quiet ceremony held in the lower conference level of the Earth Defense Command building, a building that had been underground for 47 years and had only recently been connected to street level by a proper entrance, Dorian Hale formally stepped down from command. He did not make a long speech. He did not want one. He handed his command seal to Iris Vane, who accepted it without ceremony because she had known it was coming for months and had already done what she always did with new information, processed it, planned around it, and prepared herself. She was the commander of the Earth Defense Armada now. Not hidden, not secret. The fleet had been moved to standard patrol formation in Earth's home system, visible to any sensor that cared to look, registered with the Dominion in full compliance with the new treaty obligations. It was the same fleet it had always been. It had simply stopped pretending to be smaller than it was. Ren Aldis kept command of the Unyielding. He had asked Hale, in the weeks before the handover, whether the ship would be decommissioned. It was technically older than the official commissioning date they had filed with the Dominion, since its actual construction had begun in secrecy 20 years before that. Hale had told him that the question of the ship's decommissioning was not one he needed to worry about. He was right. The civilian parliament and the defense command had agreed on this point without much argument. The Unyielding was placed in a permanent orbit around Earth. Not as a weapon, she was deactivated for combat operations. As a monument, she was visible from the surface on clear nights, moving across the sky in a slow and steady arc, a dark shape that caught the sun at the right angle and glowed. She was the thing that had been built in the dark. She was the answer to the question that nobody had thought to ask. She would stay visible now, because the time for hiding was over. On the first anniversary of the Battle of Arvath Prime, a colony-wide gathering was held in the main settlement of Arvath Prime. It was not a military ceremony. It was something quieter and less organized, a day when people came out of their houses and stood in the open air together and thought about what had happened and what had not happened. A woman named Berta Olm, the civil defense coordinator who had sent the signal into the dark, was asked to say a few words to the gathered crowd. She declined because she was not a speaker, but she stood at the front of the crowd, and she was there, and that was enough. Near the edge of the gathering, a girl of about 8 years old was sitting on her father's shoulders so she could see over the adults in front of her. The sky above Arvath Prime was clear that day. The smaller moon, Drev, was visible in the afternoon light. The girl pointed at the sky and asked her father what that was. Her father explained that it was not the moon she was pointing at. It was a ship, orbiting the planet. One of the human ships that had come a year ago. It had been left there, he told her. The colony had asked for it to stay. She thought about this for a moment. She asked what it was called. He told her. She was quiet for a few seconds with the look of a child absorbing a piece of information that she was going to keep. Then she said, "Good name." And above her, in its steady orbit, the unyielding continued its slow arc across the Arvath sky, patient, quiet, and no longer hidden from anyone.